I am here with my very good and very longtime friend, Alberto Monserrate. He is the CEO and co-founder of NewPublica. It's a PR agency in Minnesota here that specializes in multicultural marketing. And Alberto is a brilliant multicultural communications guy, mind. And so we're going to talk a lot about that for the interview today. But past his prologue, so let's start first where it all began. You were born in Puerto Rico, Alberto. What was the experience growing up in Puerto Rico like, and how did that influence where you are today, if at all?
Well, yeah, I grew up in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and had a lot of influence. I grew up on one end in a beautiful island with beautiful beaches and a very laid back culture, right? Mm-hmm. On the other end, I unfortunately, during the time I grew up there was also a lot of violence, a lot of crime. And I think that had quite a bit of an influence. I also, growing up in Puerto Rico, was very aware of a lot of social injustices that were going on. I very much got very interested in social justice, racial equity while I was growing there. So I think that this was, my teens were spent in the early 80s where there's a drug war going on down in Puerto Rico, a lot of different gangs positioning for the drug trade. And so that violence around, I think did play a lot of influence. On the other end, I grew up speaking Spanish from parents from Puerto Rico, and I was very influenced culturally by that too.
Sure. So that's interesting. I guess we've never really discussed this. Why you went to school at the University of Minnesota, but we never discussed why you studied sociology. But what you just said kind of makes a lot of sense now that I know that. So talk a little bit about what led you to sociology. I think you've already hinted at it though.
Well, I actually started with psychology. I was very interested in behavior and behavioral, what made people behave the way they do. And but the University of Minnesota also had a major in sociology that specialized in criminal justice, criminal law and procedure. And so after almost finishing a major in psychology, I kind of honestly got a little bit bored with psychology, and the whole issue of criminology really was interesting to me. And also, since I grew up around a lot of crime, I think that influenced a lot, just knowing more about why, right?
Sure.
I was a kid that asked why probably too much.
No, that's no kid can ask too much, too many whys. So it fascinates me because just in the frame of marketing, we have now, schools of communications where a lot of the people that are going into advertising or public relations are coming out of schools where they're getting degrees in strategic communications. And you and I did not. You got a degree in sociology. I got a degree in English. And I kind of think that limits getting a strategic communications degree, limits your kind of effectiveness as a marketer. What do you think of that? I think, your sociology, it's a study of human behavior. And that's a large part of what we do in marketing.
Absolutely. And I think psychology also helped me a bit. I mean, I basically ended up with a double major in psychology and in criminal justice. And I do, I do believe in strategic communications majors, but I do believe also in a broad liberal arts education. Mm-hmm. And I have hired, quite a few team members who have studied strategic communications or mass media communications. And so I value that, but in my case, most of what I've learned, I did learn some definitely about human behavior in college, and a lot about, business and relationships, which has been very important to my business in college parties.
Yeah.
Just to joke around that with my mom, she didn't appreciate it as much. But I think that really my marketing communications knowledge has really come from experience. It's come from developing relationships and learning, a lot of trial and error. And then I've had the benefit of work with a lot of colleagues who have studied, more
Yeah.
formally.
Sure, sure. Yeah, I guess what I was getting at is if you go into sociology, if you go into English. I mean, I went to English because I like to read.
Right.
It's like but it was the curiosity. I wasn't thinking of a career after what I was going to do with it, which was probably stupid at the time, and it never paid off until I started doing marketing, and then it paid off in spades. So I think kind of just the people who do strange. I'm not trying to dump on strategic communications degrees, but I'm just saying they're looking. They know where they want to go with their career, which is great.
Right.
But again, a broad liberal arts education allows you to connect a lot of different dots, I think, that you wouldn't otherwise.
Well, and actually, interestingly enough, if I would have stayed in Puerto Rico, left to the U.S., but if I would have stayed in Puerto Rico, I probably would have studied communications. There was a university there that has a very good program. I actually was very interested in journalism. I've always had a passion for journalism,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of respect for journalism.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think if you asked me at 15 years old what I want to be, I wanted to be covering wars and hurricanes, right?
Sure.
As a correspondent or something
Sure.
like that.
Sure.
And so I do think that that I always had that passion for that. I think the passion for journalism came before for marketing communications.
Right.
That kind of evolved a little bit later.
Yeah. Yeah. So from college, you became a financial advisor. So how did that come about?
Well, I came out of a reality of when I was done with college in the early 90s, where there was a deep recession, and I tried to get a job related to criminal justice, and I could not find a job, and so I did the practical thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
I got a job at what is now Ameriprise, is IDS Financial Services. I got a job doing customer service originally, helping people with their investment decisions, and that was really a practical thing. It ended up actually being a part of my career that I really enjoyed. I did move on from customer service to actually managing corporate retirement plans for several years, and it also gave me an incredible amount of experience with marketing. I mean, I did get involved with the either turning around clients who were about to leave the company, or helping members of our team bring in new corporate clients. And I also got involved actually meeting directly with the CEO and a number of other marketers from the company, and actually it was my first multicultural marketing effort. So I was in a team that was looking at, back then, American Express Financial Advisors. They were looking at doing more marketing in diverse communities. And in my case, specialized a lot in the Latino community. So that was another great opportunity. And I actually really enjoyed that part of my career.
All right. Yeah. I imagine it also has some benefits. That experience has a lot of benefits in just running your business.
Oh, absolutely. Although it was interesting because I did spend 10 years one way or another involved with investments and managing investments. Later went on to what was Prudential Securities, which is Wells Fargo Advisors now. And interestingly enough, I actually did leave. First of all, I did get some management experience that was really helpful in running a business. Got a lot of financial experience. But when I actually went out and started a business, it was actually very humbling because I actually thought I knew a lot more. And absolutely, it's been very helpful to have that knowledge, starting a business from scratch 20-some years ago and growing it. But I actually learned from a lot of immigrant business owners who had barely high school degrees. Those were actually the ones who really taught me as actually I had been their financial advisor at some point.
Oh, okay.
And I, I did business with them later on through my business, and I learned a lot more about business actually
Sure.
from them that I did in college. I joke around, but I'm not so joking around. I think I learned more about business in college from the college parties, to be quite honest.
That's awesome. So you and I met while you were still at IDS Financial, I guess is right. Yeah. And we were both working at you were also working, because you had 2 gigs at that time, right? We were also working at
Talking about Dayton Hudson, the Target, or
Dayton Hudson Corporation.
Yeah, actually that was a job I had through college. I think we met through the end of college, when I was at the end of college.
Okay. So yeah, we were both at Dayton Hudson Corporation, now known as Target, doing some customer relations / government affairs kind of thing. But I think we bonded over a shared interest in politics. So we got to know each other that way, and then and you have an interesting journey in politics. I think young people, unless you're either come from a family where politics are front and center, and you inherit your politics from your parents. And then I was like, I didn't have that experience. My parents, we didn't talk politics in my family. Mm-hmm. So I kind of was free to figure it out for myself. And I remember calling myself as an independent in college, without knowing a lot about politics, but thinking independent is better than being associated with the party. Mm-hmm. And then came to Democratic politics. You have an interesting journey yourself. So why don't you talk about how you got interested in politics and what that journey looked like.
Well, actually, probably my first involvement was as a teenager in Puerto Rico. I grew up actually in a very political family. My dad was, I think you could consider pretty radical, left wing. He had been involved with unions, and so I grew up in a very left wing home where politics was discussed a lot. And then when I moved to the U.S., I kind of continued some of that involvement through college. And then as I started reading in college and started, got very involved, I actually did get a minor in political science. There's a big interest and also in history. And so my ideology kind of evolved from very left-wing Marxist upbringing to, what I would consider more, I've been kind of center-left, center-right throughout my career. I got very involved with, once I started getting a little bit more practical, I got involved with DFL politics in college. I got involved with National Democrats. I actually did a lot of work in the Bill Clinton campaign, organizing students around the country between 91 and 92. Worked at the state Senate for a period of time also. Actually, I had great communications background where when I was working in the Senate, I would actually prepare the Daily Digest in the mornings. I would actually get up I would get earlier than anybody else to what was then the DFL caucus in the Senate, go through every newspaper, actually cut articles, choose what everybody, not just what the senators were going to read, but also what the reporters were going to read. And so just pasted, copied it, and then distributed it throughout the Senate. So it was actually a fun gig to have.
Right.
In my early 20s.
For young people, that's why they call them newspaper clippings or news clippings.
Yes, very different now. And we have a lot of newsletters that kind of keep you, but back then it was quite the story. I also did a lot of interviews with senators that we would send out to radio stations and things like that. So very old media in the early 90s.
Yeah, right. How does that political experience or political understanding influence your communications practice now?
Well, interestingly enough, I was very, very involved in politics till 25. I mean, that's almost all I did. Mm-hmm. And I got burned out, and I decided to take off for about 10 years, actually, which I thought was very healthy. So had a family, helped raise, two beautiful kids who are grown up now, and went into the investment world and then started a business. And politics, actually being involved with many political campaigns really helped develop further both marketing and communications, media relations skills. I did actually run for office in 2010. I ran for the Minneapolis School Board. I got to chair the Minneapolis School Board for a couple of years and served a term. And that also taught me a lot about communications. Minneapolis, we were, from crisis to crisis at Minneapolis Public Schools.
Yeah.
So learned quite a bit about crisis management. Spent a lot of time with our chief communications officer, Stan Ally, who's a communicator too, communications professional. So yeah, a lot. Politics, I think, is a place where you really can learn a lot about communications. You really can learn a lot about marketing. You really fine tune your skills. And it's a very, as you know, it can be a very, especially campaigns can be very, very, very fast paced, which prepares us well for what the world we're living now, which is 24/7, million different devices and platforms. And
Right. So you and I were partners in an early digital publishing venture on Minnesota politics. And that kind of leads me into my next thing is you had, your media career. Mm-hmm. So your next venture after financial management, financial services is a Latino Communications Network. Mm-hmm. So tell me about, let's talk about the LCN.
Well, first of all, when I was in the corporate world, I went through training, which ironically was meant to retain me in the corporations I was working in. That training came very clear that I should be an entrepreneur. So it was actually training to retain me that actually kind of led me to actually leave the corporate world and start a business. So I had that entrepreneurial bug. And I also noticed that I needed a deeper connection with, at that time, the Latino community. Originally from Puerto Rico, grew up in, my adult years in Minnesota, and the community was growing rapidly, and I also needed a deeper connection. I actually saw myself staying. None of the environments I worked in, corporations I worked with, was diverse. Mm-hmm. I saw myself staying late at night sometimes, looking forward to talking to the janitors, the cleaning crew, who often spoke in Spanish. Yeah. That just kind of got me to want to connect more and more with the community. I did do I did help the companies I was working with some philanthropies and philanthropic efforts that were involved with, so I started sitting on a few boards. And then I noticed the community was growing rapidly, and so decided to start a Latino media company back then, which, everybody who listened to me thought I had gone crazy. My mom was almost crying. What happened to you? My friends, my colleagues were thinking, oh, you must be going to a competitor. Why would anybody be so stupid to start something like that? So it was quite, I really believed in it. I really wanted to change. My daughter was actually just about to be born back then. So it really sounded like a crazy thing, but I really believed in it. I knew I had done a fair amount of research, literally in Lake Street, which is where we based ourselves, East Lake Street. It was almost like a block a week where more and more Latinos were moving into. Latino businesses were starting everywhere. Areas in East Lake Street that have been very economically depressed were just booming with activity. And so that just attracted me. And I also, my love for journalism, if this was an opportunity to kind of go back to what I wanted to do originally, right? To leave a little bit the practical and going into media, which is something I really love.
So let's talk about you have an impressive roster of media properties that you developed under the Latino Communications Network. La Prensa, the newspaper, Vida y Sabor magazine, La Invasora Radio, Minneapolis Cinco de Mayo Festival, and so event, and Hispanic Yellow Pages directory. So can you talk a little bit about each of those?
Yeah, well, we started, one of the things I noticed when we looked at the landscape, we actually thought about starting an agency that would market to the Latino community locally. That was kind of our beginning, and then we thought we would expand from there. And then we kind of noticed that a lot of the media, local ethnic media was barely surviving. You had newspapers who struggled paying the printer. You had radio stations which struggled, paying for the licenses and all that. So we thought that to develop some economies of scale and bring in different media outlets into one place, that will give us also the ability to hire talent and to be able to have more stability, right? And so that's really how we started. So we actually started with a magazine, Vida y Sabor, which we were kind of looking at the landscape. There was one Latino paper and one Latino radio station. And then there was another new newspaper that was starting out. La Prensa had started already, Gente de Minnesota was starting. La Prensa was more based out of the west side of St. Paul, that looked at what was traditionally a Mexican-American second, third generation community, where in Minneapolis, you saw primarily recent immigrants who spoke primarily Spanish. So those were the two papers. And then we first thought about, let's do something different. And back then, in the year 2000, we're looking at younger members of the Latinx community. And that's why I started with Vida y Sabor, which at that point was like a Latino City Pages. We actually started as an insert in several zip codes for city pages. And so we started doing that. Then we actually bought Gente de Minnesota. We later on bought La Prensa and started combining that. And then we tried to buy the existing radio station. We couldn't come up with agreements, so we actually started one with La Invasora. So that ended up at its top before Google and Facebook, grabbed so much advertising money. We actually grew to close to 40 employees at our top, with 3 publications, 2 Spanish radio stations. And it really was great. I mean, our mission was to be the most effective way to reach Latinos in Minnesota. And that was definitely, we captured 50% of the Latino advertising market locally at that point. And just grew a very fun, effective company.
Sure. Well, a lot of different types of content. Content marketing is the thing now. I mean, it always has been, but people are pouring money into it now. And you were you were well ahead of the trend of PR agencies incorporating publications, owning publications. So then you started NewPublica. So did Latino Communications presumably transitioned into NewPublica? Is that correct?
Yeah, well, I'd probably say that the peak for Latino Communications Network was probably, somewhere between 2008, 2010. Actually, things were going so well, that's when I decided to run for school board. And then we didn't know it at that time, but then Google and Facebook happened. So significant amounts of revenue. A lot of the businesses that advertised with us, we started noticing were cutting their budget significantly. We started finding out where they were going, and we found out later that Google and Facebook and other online advertisers were really grabbing a lot of attention. We probably didn't react quick enough, and we actually ended up losing about half of our revenue in about a 3-year period, which came with layoffs. Unfortunately, yeah. We were actually going down at the same rate the entire market was. We always kept 50% of the market, and so everything, the local TV station, Univision, different radio stations, all really went down dramatically. So at that point, we made a decision to get out of radio. We had partners that either we needed to buy out or they needed to buy us out. And so we did a projection for radio. It didn't look very good, actually completely own the radio station. So we actually decided to get out of radio And we by then had noticed that a lot of the clients that were coming to us not so much because they wanted to buy advertising, but they wanted to reach the Latino community, which we had by then formed really good alliances with other ethnic media, Hmong media, African American media, and other media outlets. So we were developing more and more expertise in diverse communities.
Mm-hmm.
And by 2014, when NewPublica was founded, we actually made a decision that there was more of an interest in consulting than there was in media. We had a big passion for media. We had exited radio. We had kept publications that had a lot of activity online. And so what we actually decided to do is we formed NewPublica with my business partner, Melissa Franzen. And then we actually decided to buy the assets of Latino Communications Network as a division.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is something that over the years is really integrated well. Our primary business right now is communications consulting. Primarily, we're known for multicultural, and I think that's an area that we have a lot of expertise on. We do also mainstream communications, and it's often, we attract clients through the multicultural, and we're able to do other types of communication. But that ended up the media, and we've kind of developed other media, like we've developed now New Prensa, for example. It is really integrated well into some of the campaigns that we have.
Yeah.
And,
so what kind of, obviously multicultural, and you do mainstream as well, but what kind of clients you work with?
So our clients have primarily over the years been a good combination of government agencies and foundations and nonprofits. And more recently, we've been working more and more with corporate clients. That's been probably our biggest area of growth. We have noticed over the years, but I think especially over the last year, where there's been a what I would say a huge increase in demand for both communicating to multicultural communities and also to communicate about racial equity.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is the type of clients we worked on. With government agencies, it's often, we work a lot in transportation, for example, but we also work a lot with, like, for example, with the city of St. Paul, with their college savings account or safe housing or other issues that they get involved with, often in collaboration with foundations. And so the type of work we do is pretty diverse, everything from traditional media relations, occasional crisis management, drafting communications. Community engagement has been a very rapidly growing part of our business, where we actually go out to diverse communities, primarily, although we go out to pretty much all communities, but we usually get hired because of the multicultural communities that we reach out to. And so, everything from going door to door to having community engagement meetings to doing all kinds of engagement. We work very closely, and this is something that I think has been very important. We work very closely with the Latinx community, African American community, East African community, Hmong Native communities. And I think that a key thing, other than knowing, developing some expertise of where people are in the, digital space in the social media space, and also what type of media people in those communities consume. But also we've developed long-term mutually beneficial relationships with members of the communities. Sure. So we usually have people who are reaching out, who often haven't reached out to those communities before. So when we reach out, they're going to recognize us. We've worked together for many years. So I think that old school in-person one-on-one relationship building is often been more valuable than all the digital expertise that is incredibly important, but that other people can do too. So well,
the amount of work you put into it, you get a lot back. That's harder work. there's a lot of legwork in that. There's a lot of, relationship building isn't easy. It's not it's not as easy as putting a couple of dollars into a Facebook account and running a digital ad. You actually have to meet people and yeah. So I can see why that would be why that would pay off.
Research is another area that we really developed during the pandemic. And so, holding virtual listening sessions or focus groups in all the communities that I mentioned before has also been another area. So it's been fun that we've been able to get involved from the research point of view to then crafting messages and campaigns and then actually executing those campaigns. That's been another. I always like to say, we've developed a lot of insight, but you don't really know until you really know, right? So that research is also very important.
Yeah, and so that gets me to kind of my next thing is public relations industry is 70% white, advertising probably more. And so, when marketers think, as largely white marketers think of reaching people of color, they don't probably think as penetratingly as they should be about who they're trying to reach. So if they're talking about Latinx, they're probably thinking Mexican or, so tell me, let's talk about the diversity of communities of color. Start with Latinx. So, in Minnesota in particular, we have a bunch of different communities that fall under the umbrella of Latinx.
Yeah, so and that's the case with just about every community. First of all, people of color now make close to 20% of the population in Minnesota. Immigrants make close to 10% of the population. So you have a very significant percentage of the population that you're not effectively reaching out unless you are developing expertise there. There is an incredible amount of interest in marketing, obviously, to wider communities, and I think that after George Floyd and after the murder of George Floyd and also after the pandemic, a lot of that interest increased quite a bit also. And if you actually look at the communications firms, which many of them we actually collaborate with and we work closely with, but you go to, all you got to do is go to the websites and you're not going to see a lot of diversity. And that's something that's been interesting about the communications industry. I think also from the advertising industry, maybe not so much, but it is something that strikes me. As a matter of fact, a lot of our team members are communicators of color who got attracted to the industry because they heard a communicator of color, an executive speak at an event and recruit him, right?
Yeah.
And but they did say that they struggled a bit. So I think it's an industry that has taken a bit of a while to adapt. Like I said, I do see a lot of interest from other firms, and we collaborate with them. But they're very white, and campaigns are often very white. We recently worked with a corporate client. They had developed a campaign. They have an excellent marketing department. They had developed a campaign. They did a couple of focus groups around that campaign, and it completely bombed with people of color, right? And actually, that was one of their main audiences that they were trying to reach. And so we had to develop, everything from scratch, from the name of the campaign to, there were references that immigrants, for example, could not relate to at all. Mm-hmm. Songs that they were singing or, or words they were using that just were completely bombing. And so we saw the interest. What a lot of times is lacking is actually the knowledge and the expertise in communicating effectively. And so part of it is understanding the diversity of the community. The Latinx community is an example of a community that is very diverse. It is actually in the state of Minnesota about 60-some% is Mexican American or has ancestry in Mexico. There is then a significant amount of members of the community that are from Central America. Also significant and growing from South America. Ecuadorians are a growing group, significant number of Puerto Ricans. The community, now makes officially more than 5% of the population. And you know, in some areas of the state actually make very significant percentages. I think, you know, other than, well, I mean, you know, St. Paul has had a significant population, Minneapolis has a significant population, but there are towns around the state, especially in southern Minnesota, like Austin or, you know, different towns in southern Minnesota where, you know, the population will reach 20% or more, and schools will actually have a very, very significant percentage of the population. So it has been a growing community. You know, you also have, you know, the Asian community. The Hmong community is the largest and one of the biggest, you know, becoming one of the most influential communities in the Twin Cities. We actually do a lot of work and help manage communications for several organizations. And there is the Karen, you know, community now that the city of St. Paul, which we collaborate with on campaigns, actually translates a lot of their documents to both Hmong and Karen and Spanish, Somali and Oromo, right? So that's another community, the Somali community, where the East African community, there's a significant Somali community, there's also a significant Oromo community, right? And others, right? So I think the other type of diversity we see is rural and urban. I think that's, you know, definitely in the Latino community, you see big differences between people who live in southern Minnesota and people who live in the city. And then the biggest one that we're working on now, where it's in political campaigns or marketing campaigns, is generational. We're seeing some big generational shifts in every community of color that I mentioned before. Generational differences of how you market, what language you use, what issues are important to people. So a lot of diversity within the diversity.
Right.
Minnesota is no longer where diversity means whether you're Swedish or Norwegian.
Yeah. But this is great because, you know, like when marketers in our largely white industry need to think about all these different nuances, and so there are visual differences between you know, South American countries and cultural references, and again your languages that need so.
And a clear example, you know, very well too, that communications, visual communications, especially nowadays, can be even more important than written communications. And where, you know, a lot of the more traditional cultures in Minnesota tended to use colors that weren't quite so bright, right? So that's something we struggle a bit with clients when we're developing visual communications, where they would like to use colors that we tend to find a little bit more boring. But actually, all the communities I mentioned before that's something that we tend to have in common is brighter colors.
Yeah.
And so that's a perfect example of where a lot of times, you know, a lot of marketers are missing the boat.
Yeah. Even in, I mean, just within the United States, going from Minnesota to like New Mexico, you notice that there's a larger percentage of Latinx population in New Mexico than there, at least when I visited years ago, than in Minnesota. And the colors are, well, not bright, but pastel bright. And you don't see a lot of pastel colors in Minnesota. So it was striking to me. Yeah.
You know, you mentioned New Mexico too. We talk about diversity nationally because we've done some national work too. The Latino community is very diverse around the United States. It's something I think that was discussed quite a bit in the, you know, last presidential race and a lot of the political campaigns. And you have in New Mexico, for example, a largely Mexican American community. Many of them have several generations that have lived in New Mexico. You see that in Colorado too. So their attitudes are going to be very different than in other parts of the country. You see California, largely Mexican American, with a lot more recent immigrants that you would see maybe in New Mexico or Colorado. And then you see Florida, where you have Cuban Americans, a significant number of Puerto Ricans, and a significant amount of South Americans also that make the majority. In New York, you see overwhelmingly, you know, Latinos from the Caribbean, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic. So the Latinx community is a community that is definitely very diverse. And a lot of the communications we do right now are in Spanish, and a lot of the communications right now are in English, where we're communicating to members of the community who don't speak very much Spanish, right? So there's a lot of diversity there too.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned Cuba. The other thing is, I think a lot of left-leaning people assume that people of color writ large are going to be left-leaning because, of course, they are. There's a lot of political diversity as well among people of color, and that's most glaringly obvious in Miami, and the Cuban community traditionally has been conservative.
Right. I mean, George Bush actually got George Bush son got 45% of the Hispanic voters. That went down over the years. Trump actually, ironically, a lot of people would find it hard to believe, but actually support picked up in the Latino community. And so that can happen everywhere from, communities with immigrant populations that have left Cuba or Venezuela or Nicaragua, and where anything that they perceive close to socialism is something that is not appealing to them. You also have parts of the country, you go to Arizona and you go to New Mexico, a lot of people would be surprised that there are members of the Latino community there who have been there several generations who have actually very anti-immigrant views themselves. So it is a very, very diverse community. I think that marketing often to the Latino community, as it is with other communities, multicultural communities, has a lot to do with where you're marketing. So to really pay attention to the zip code and where you are going and really get to know that community, the components. I think there are things that can cut across, like Chicago has a Latino community that's been there longer, but is very similar to the Minnesota one, right? And so, same thing happens in a lot of Midwest states or even Southern states, where the percentages, the demographics are going to be very similar, but they're going to be very different than where I was just last week in Miami, for example.
I wanted to get to this. You mentioned zip code. You also mentioned that, a lot of the equity budgets basically have been expanding, or people have been spending more money on equity efforts in wake of the George Floyd murder and the kind of awakening that occurred as a result of that. You are in that neighborhood. So tell me about what happened in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, and what your perspective was on it.
Well, George Floyd's murder was devastating to a lot of people in our area, and especially to people of color. It was actually very traumatic for a lot of members of the community. I actually saw the murder happen on video just a few minutes after the night it actually happened, and that had a very big effect on me personally and a lot of members of our team. And then obviously the civil unrest that happened later. Our office actually was is close to Lake Street, not in the area that got affected the most. It was in the Lynn Lake area by Lake and Lindale. But our building was actually hit, and there's a jewelry store that got broken into. So it had a very direct impact. The gas station, a block away, got burned down. As a matter of fact, I was leaving work a couple of days after. I couldn't find a gas station or a place to eat, because everything, there's at least 3 gas stations close by that had been closed, that had been actually burned down. So we had a very direct impact. And then, from the business point of view, just about every client we had wanted to have some kind of impact statement right at the beginning. So we had a lot of very tough discussions with clients about what was appropriate and what was not appropriate. I know that a lot of our advice shifted away from communications and more into do something and communicate what you've done after you've done it, because people were getting a little bit tired of statements. So our team was very impacted. Several of our team members were actually out protesting, but we also had a lot of conflicted clients who were struggling with everything that's happening. We did notice that increase in diversity training, equity and inclusion training went up dramatically. We don't do that type of business, but we did, as results of a lot of that training, get a lot of requests for helping draft communications and also increasing outreach to communities. So it was a rough period of time. A year later, it's kind of interesting seeing what has happened. I know we have several of the nonprofit clients that we support have actually done some very significant things. We have actually seen some corporate budgets. I know there's, maybe not everything that was committed to has come through. And that is something that people have to explore, and a little bit of worry that the interest, might be waning a bit. But we actually have seen a very significant increase with investments. One of the clients we work with is LISC, for example, which is a nonprofit that is a national nonprofit that has a local branch. And that's where a lot of corporations actually donate their money into racial equity. And we've seen very significant budgets and some programs that are transformational, like building wealth among developers that are rebuilding Lake Street, for example. I can't remember what, it was like over 1,900 buildings got damaged one way or another. Several of them got completely destroyed. So we're helping communications in programs that are helping developers of color from the neighborhood actually rebuild and own those buildings. So that's transformational work that I think can do a lot of good and can make things. But we'll see long term where are all of this. There's a lot of work till we get to where we need to get in this kind of stuff.
Right. Well, I do think that what you just mentioned, the building of wealth, is, as you say, transformational. We'll see how judgment will come, I guess, 10 years down the line or whatever. But that it seems to me is the place to start. It is that building of wealth idea.
Well, living in Minneapolis, which is a city I love, absolutely love this city, but it also happens to have some of the biggest inequities in the nation, right? But it also happens to have some of the most active philanthropy and very engaged communities. So I think Minneapolis can be an example for the country on how things can be done.
Well, speaking of disparities, right? There has long been in Minnesota. We've long been at the top or near the top of disparities in all kinds of measures among people of color, but significantly among education. And you have long been passionate about education. So tell me where your passion comes from and some of the work that you've done.
So I had a very non-traditional education pathway. I know I've shared with you, I got kicked out of high school at the end of my junior year. And it very much looked like then I was going to be a high school dropout. I had a principal, actually the principal who kicked me out, who made it a point that I stayed in high school, tutored me, wrote a letter of recommendation for me to get into college, and just really kept an eye on me so I didn't get any trouble my senior year. Made sure I got in another school. That had a huge impact in my life. I mean, at that point, pretty much everybody had given up on me except for my mom, and so having that grown up that had kicked me out of school and later took that interest really made me think, where would I be if I wouldn't have continued to go to school and have the opportunity to get out of the environment I was in and go to the University of Minnesota, which actually was a great place for me to go to school to. And so then later on, when I found what it looked like was success in my career, I really started looking at, I got to somehow give something back. Both my parents were actually teachers and begged me to not go into teaching. And, so I found other ways to get involved with education. So I got involved with a number of nonprofit boards. Then I helped I was on the founding board of several charter schools, some of them that are well known today, Hiawatha Academies, KIPP, Twin Cities Academies. And then out of that interest came an interest in actually running for school board in Minneapolis, very much with that racial equity point of view. I could not think of a single a single issue I could get involved with that I thought could have more of an impact than education. If there's a lot of other things that need to be taken care of, right? We do have a lot of disparities in healthcare and in income and the judicial system, the way the police treats young people, especially young Black men compared to other races. Those disparities are very real and are things that our children have to deal with on a daily basis. Some of our kids are risking their lives when they walk to school, for example. But a school with the right environment and with the right tools and with the right kind of support can really be the difference, and can be the key to developing some future generational wealth and some eliminating some disparities. So that's been an issue. My son was born 26 years ago, and since he was born, I've been involved one way or another with that topic. And it actually is an area we've done a lot of support on with communications, both in K-12 education and with early childhood, if you can start even earlier, to eliminate some of the opportunity gaps. So we've done a lot of support with legislative campaigns or other types of campaigns. A Little Moments Counts campaign, which is an early childhood campaign to educate parents around the state, led by Health Partners and Minnesota Public Radio and United Way. That's a program we've been very involved with from the very beginning, just to getting the information to the people we want to reach.
Oh, cool. What should have I asked you that I didn't ask you?
Well, you did a very good job in asking questions, and probably got more out of this interview, but more out of me than most people I've known. So I think maybe thinking about the future, right, and how the type of work we do will change. Which by the way, we have no idea.
Right.
But I do think a passion of mine is keeping up with how communications are changing and how communities continue to change. I think we're looking at the U.S. as a country that will be majority minority. Term I don't like, but people of color will make a majority of the country. I think more and more campaigns, for example, will actually start in communities of color, and then those campaigns will expand into what some people call mainstream audiences. I do think things will become more international. A growing part of our team is actually, living abroad, and we're doing some creative work with people abroad that's getting more and more exciting. The pandemic and Zoom kind of created opportunities. So I think there's some very interesting communications. What I do hope we figure out at some point is how do we get 24/7, 7 days a week with 20 different platforms is kind of hard to sustain. So I'm kind of hoping we find we kind of start reducing those, and we start claiming back some of our time.
I hear you. I'm with you there. So how do people get a hold of you?
Actually, probably the easiest way is to Google me. Google my name, Alberto Monserrate. You can email me at alberto@newpublica.com. But if you Google me, you'll find my phone number. You'll find my email and every other way to communicate with me. So.
And I couldn't end this podcast without saying Alberto Jose Monserrate Suarez. When I found out that you had 4 names and they were so cool to say, I practiced and practiced and practiced till I got it nailed down. And whenever I see Alberto, it's Alberto Jose Monserrate Suarez because it's so cool.
Yes, you actually learn how to say that better than most, and that's one of the things that I've reclaimed as my full name. So not everybody has to learn how to say it as well as you do, but yeah, it's Alberto Jose Monserrate Suarez. We have 2 last names, and I was cruel enough to do that to my kids. I gave my kids 2 last names also. So
yes, well done, sir. Well done.
Getting their driver's license has been a challenge.
Good. All right. Well, thank you, my friend. I appreciate you taking time out to chat, and we will talk soon enough.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to talk to you again. And one of these days, now the pandemic is over, I look forward to playing some of those guitars you have in the background with you.
In person. We'll do a jam session. Fantastic.
All right.
All right. Take care.
Great talking to you.